21. On the spiritual compromise. The question of resisting evil, that is, whether or not one ought to resist and how one should do so, is not a question of sentiment, of arbitrariness, of taste and temperament, but a question of character and religiosity, a question of religious character. It is a question of the fundamental religious capacity for love, and moreover of love which embraces the world. The entire underlying question of our research makes no sense for those who reject the world, who do not recognize its value, do not see the divine forces and responsibilities contained within it, and do not willingly accept them. The external manifestation of evil that must be combated enters the very fabric of a rejected world, and if in such a world there is nothing that ought to be protected from a villainous attack, if it deserves only to be rejected, turned away from, and abandoned, then the very question of force and the sword inevitably disappears and becomes void. The question of the sword is a practical question, and its answer depends on the practical situation, such that in rejecting the world, one rejects the sword, but not the reverse. However, one who speaks not merely with words, with a type of phrase, but who truly rejects the world, he has no reason to include his own identity within it. For so long as a person agrees to live in this world, he thereby accepts it already by the very fact that he makes use of it, of its benefits and its possibilities. No solitude, no desert life, no reduction of needs expresses a consistent rejection of the world. On the contrary, all of these remain special kinds of exercises, and moreover sophisticated exercises that create a rigorous condition of choice for the sake of acquiring a new way of seeing. In a word, every person who does not kill himself embraces the world, and thus the question of the sword has meaning and significance for him. For a Christian, the very essence of the question is resolved by following Christ. The Christian is called to follow in his footsteps, to follow how he embraced the world without embracing the evil in it, how he perceived evil, through both experience and as witness, while rejecting it and leading a life or death struggle with it. And it is in following Christ that true Christians have always historically accepted the burden of peace and the anguish of the world, and with it the torment of evil and the burden of fighting against it, both in themselves and in others. In accepting this torment and struggle, they also prepared for the completion of their own path of the cross, to embrace death in the struggle at the hands of the rejected evil. In order to adequately accept the world, we must clearly see the work of God on earth and creatively accept it as our own through our abilities, our will, and our actions. It's not your business to give God's work to others, but to accept God's work as your own. And to the extent that this is possible for a person, then by this measure will he correctly discern and solve the question of the sword. Those who reject the sword insist that the path of the sword is an unrighteous path. This is true in the sense of an absolute moral assessment. However, it is not true in the sense of guiding us to a practical outcome. The dream is clear that for a morally perfect man, there would be no insurmountable obstacles in the purely spiritual triumph over evil, that he could stop and transform every villain with one glance, a word, and a movement. This dream is understandable. It is a reflection of two intertwined ideas, the idea of the godlikeness of a morally perfect man and the idea of the omnipotence of God. It seems to invoke the fact that a truly virtuous person is by definition approaching divine perfection, from which his spiritual power is increased to such a level that before it, the villain finds it difficult to help themselves. This is a lofty but naive dream, and further, its bankruptcy is revealed the moment its purveyors try to turn it into a universal rule of human behavior. This dream is untenable spiritually because the conversion and transformation of the villain must be his own individual, autonomous act, a flare of his personal freedom, and not a reflection of someone else's perfection. And if this could be otherwise, he would have been transformed long ago when God breathed life into him. This dream is untenable in that, historically, we find that the spiritual power of the righteous has its limits in the face of inherent villainy, and it would seem that it is not a Christian's place to overestimate this dream, having before his eyes the images of many saints tortured by unrepentant and unconverted villains. The path of the sword is an unrighteous path, but who is this man who is frightened of this unrighteousness, declares it villainy, and flees from it? This is the same person who throughout his life not only tolerated all kinds of unrighteousness, because it was required or useful to him, but now always sins with a gentle soul, sins in his own favor, and does not even recall it. And suddenly, when it is necessary to assume the burden of statehood, a ministry that, according to the profound words of Peter the Great, is truly the work of God and therefore does not tolerate negligence, then he remembers that he must necessarily be a sinless and righteous man, panics, in an affected way declares this unrighteousness sin, and shows it to be in the wrong. Yes, the way of the sword is an unrighteous path. But there is no such spiritual law which decrees that in going through unrighteousness, one passes into the domain of sin. If it were so, then all people, constantly going through unrighteousness and even through sin, would be doomed to an inescapable death, for sin would be piled upon sin, and an overwhelming burden would drag man into the abyss. No, the wisdom of life consists not in a paranoia of righteousness, but in the need to courageously engage in unrighteousness, walking through it, but not towards it, entering into it in order to withdraw from it. Yes, the path of force and the sword is not a righteous path, but is there a path which is? Is this the path of sentimental non-resistance which we have already exposed above as a path of betraying the weak, complicity with the villain, declaring the innocence of the oppressor, and, to top it off, naive, hypocritical complacency? Of course, this path has a more tranquil, more decent, less bloody appearance, but only frivolity and malicious stupidity fail to understand at what price this tranquility and decency is bought. Anyone who, in the face of aggressive villainy, requires an ideal moral perfection in all outcomes and accepts nothing less, does not understand the central tragedy of life. This tragedy consists in the fact that there is no ideal outcome in such a situation. The mere existence of a bitter will contrary to love and the spirit in the soul of another makes such an unquestionably righteous outcome extremely challenging and problematic. For how is one to avoid judgment and condemnation? How can we not leave the fullness of love while not being outraged in the spirit? How do we not defect while not resisting? In the presence of real evil, poured out externally in the form of evil deeds, the ideal, righteous outcome becomes an imaginary, spurious mission. This outcome is never realized and never can be, because the dilemma facing the person does not leave room for it. Here is formulated that great clash between the spiritual vocation of man and his moral perfection, which always haunts a person in the conditions of his earthly life. God's work must be freely perceived and voluntarily accepted by each one of us. But it is not enough to establish oneself in service to Him, one must be still stronger in His defense. It is always possible that there will arise individual people, perhaps cadres, alliances, and organizations of men who, freely rejecting God's cause, will establish themselves in opposition and lead this opposition's attack. When this occurs, the villain, who violates the spiritual vocation of man and who urges others to do the same, puts before everyone who has taken up God's cause the following dilemma: to betray the work of God and to alter one's spiritual and religious vocation, to observe His righteousness, or to remain faithful to God and one's vocation, choosing and implementing an unrighteous path. In this situation there is no righteous outcome, for betraying the work of God and changing one's spiritual vocation is an outcome that only the ignorant can consider to be righteous, and this absence of a morally perfect option for action in the face of the attacking villain must be understood and thought through to its end. In the objective absence of a righteous outcome, the very question of such an outcome turns out to be a false one, and the very search for it becomes a hopeless affair, behind the hopelessness of which is concealed, sometimes successfully, timidity and insincerity. On the contrary, courage and honesty require here an open acceptance of spiritual compromise. If in everyday life and in ordinary discourse a compromise consists in the calculated concession of a person who follows his personal or group interests and hopes that a small sacrifice will reap great benefits, then the spiritual compromise that we describe is not in the personal interest and does not seek to reap any benefit. This is instead a selfless acceptance of one's own unrighteousness in the fight against the villain as the enemy of God's work. Anyone who accepts a spiritual compromise does not think about himself, but about the subject. And if he does think about himself, then it is not in the measure of his ordinary interest, but in the measure of his spiritual and moral strain. And if indeed he does think of himself, it is still to a lesser extent than one who hides himself, trembling over his imaginary righteousness. The compromise of the sword-bearer is that he consciously and voluntarily accepts through his will the morally unrighteous outcome as a spiritual necessity. And if every deviation from moral perfection is unrighteousness, then he takes upon himself unrighteousness. And if every conscious, voluntary assumption of unrighteousness by the will creates guilt, then he accepts the guilt of his decision. If before he had the greatest joy in life, approaching the requirements of a good conscience, then he denies himself this happiness as an impossibility. Faced with a real villain, the conscience calls a person to such feats which are only available to the divine in his omnipotence, and for which the thought and language of man lack both concepts and words. These feats, if they were possible, would deny the very mode of divided being inherent in people on earth, and suppose the possibility that the righteous man, while remaining himself, could enter the soul of the villain, become him, without following through, in order to neutralize the villainous impulse and remove it, turning the villain into a righteous man. But these feats do not by force belong to man, but to God, and the dream of them remains essentially futile on earth. In the face of this impossibility, one who resists must settle on a spiritually necessary, albeit an unrighteous path. He must accept this present moral hopelessness and overcome it by feeling, by will, by thought, by word, and by deed. Desiring the good, devoted to the good, he sees himself forced in the name of his religiously correct goal to take on unrighteousness and perhaps guilt, and, as it were, depart from the good, and moreover with full cognizance of what he is doing. His position is morally tragic, and it is understandable that provision of an escape from it is a burden shouldered only by the strong. But a strong man asserts his power precisely by the fact that he does not flee from the conflict into an allegedly virtuous passivity and does not close his eyes to his tragic nature, thus falling from cowardice into crookedness. A strong man sees the tragedy of his situation and goes out to meet it, enter it, and eliminate it. He takes on unrighteousness, not for himself, but in the name of God's work. And yet what he does in this fight is his own deed, his own action, which he does not think to ascribe to God. This is his human outcome, which he himself recognizes as a spiritual compromise, and which is at the same time his feat. For this is the great, substantive strain of the preeminent struggle for goodwill. The feat is not only in the waging of the struggle itself, but also in the spiritual strain required for a frank and sustained acceptance of potential guilt. The strain of the spirit is needed here not only to kill the villain, but also to carry out the act despite its imperfection, not abandoning the required deed with a cowardly renunciation of its necessity, but also not idealizing its moral content. The tragedy of evil and the struggle against it is resolved through the acceptance and realization of this feat. And the selfsame feat is, it turns out, all the greater the more alive the ability to illuminate it with the ray of divine perfection remains in he who carries it out. It is necessary to see not only the necessity of its strain and its enactment, but also the human hopelessness that gives birth to it. What is needed is not an expedient mental mechanism of the sword, but a spiritual organism that is clear-sighted in its decision and strong enough to endure this sight, in order not only to carry out the act, but also to illuminate it with God's ray, and recognizing its unrighteousness, to see it again in its spiritual necessity, and again to enact it to the extent required, and to embrace all this not from personal motives, but on a religious basis. Fighting evil always requires heroism, not only when it is exercised in the form of internal efforts, educating a person and cultivating his spiritual wings, but also when it is exercised in the form of a compelling and suppressing sword. The heroism of the sword-bearer consists not only in the fact that his work is difficult, hectic, full of deprivations, dangers, and misery, but also in the fact that a special spiritual effort is required on his part to protect his personal spiritual Kremlin. For his heroism is the heroism of a consciously and confidently accepted unrighteousness. Moreover, a man who takes up the sword in a despairing struggle with a villain is heroic because he carries the burden of peace. Placed before the central tragic dilemma which leaves no moral outcome available to him, he religiously accepts this despair, and choosing the least unrighteous and yet most challenging path of the sword, he takes this path as his destiny. The religious acceptance of one's destiny is the basic heroism to which each person is called, not to accept fate in the sense of quietism, or determinism, or lack of will, or fatalism, but to a volitional, vitally active, and religiously faithful acceptance which contemplates life as a service, illuminates it with a ray of vocation, and pours all personal power into religious service to a religious vocation. The fate of man is, in his life on earth, to confront the outbreak of uninvited evil. It is impossible to avoid this fate, and thus there are only two possibilities: either to be dishonorable and turn away from this struggle, to dishonorably live through it by both blindness and cowardice, or the honorable path of accepting it, comprehending this acceptance as a service and remaining faithful to this vocation. But this means taking up the sword in the name of God's work. In this acceptance of his destiny and the sword, man considers his soul, but affirms his spirit and his dignity. He considers his soul not only in the lowest sense that he agrees to give up his terrestrial life in the fight against the villain, but also in the higher sense that he takes on the responsibility of action, the burden of which he then bears, perhaps all his life, with shuddering and disgust at the very memory of it. He takes up not only the burden of death, but also the burden of killing, and in the burden of killing not only the pain of the act itself, but also the burden of decision, responsibility, and perhaps guilt. His spiritual destiny leads him to the sword, he accepts it, and the sword becomes his destiny, and in this outcome, in this heroic resolution to the central tragic dilemma, he is not righteous, but he is right. Christ did not teach the sword, he taught love. But not once, not in a single word did he condemn the sword, neither in the sense of an organized state for which the sword is the last sanction, nor in the sense of military titles and affairs. And his first disciples, the apostles Peter and Paul, 1 Peter 2:13-17, Romans 13:1-7, revealed the positive meaning of this non-judgment. True, the apostles were instructed that the business of the sword was not theirs, and that they that take the sword shall perish with the sword, Matthew 26:52, and Christ did not want a militant defense for himself, but it is precisely in this refusal of defense, and in his words on the paying of taxes, Matthew 22:17-21, Mark 12:14-17, and in a conversation with Pilate, John 18:33-38, 19:9-11, that in the spirit of free, regal loyalty is revealed, that which the apostles later claimed and the comprehension of which was later lost to such rejectors of the world as Athenagoras, Tertullian, and others. And so earthly death by the sword remains the highest gospel penalty which is foretold for the bearer of the sword. Christ taught love, but it is love that raises us to great heights, both to the sacrifice of unrighteousness and to the sacrifice of life. Yes, those who take the sword perish by the sword, but it is love that can induce a person to accept such a demise. He who takes the sword is ready to kill, but he must also be ready for the eventuality that he is killed. And this is why accepting the sword is the acceptance of death, and he who fears death must not take up the sword. However, in love, not only does the fear of death disappear, but the foundations and motivations that lead to the sword are discovered. Death is not only a penalty implicit in the sword itself, it is also a living measure of the acceptability of the sword. For to take up a sword makes sense only in the name of what a person really should die for, in the name of the work of God on earth. For he who neither knows nor possesses anything in the world which is higher than himself and his personal life, to take up the sword is pointless. For him it is more sensible to throw down the sword to save himself, at the price of betrayal and accepting a humiliating obedience to villains. But for God's work, in himself, in others, and in the world, it makes sense to go to death. For in dying, he gives the lesser for the greater, the personal for the suprapersonal, the mortal for the immortal, and the human for God. And it is by this effect, precisely this effect, that he makes his own lesser great, his personal suprapersonal, and his mortal immortal. For to himself, to man, he attaches the dignity of being God's servant. This is the sense in which death is the measure of the acceptability of the sword. This entire spiritual compromise, revealed and confirmed by all that we have written, is inevitable for man in his earthly life. All earthly life is not reducible to it, but upon it rests the foundation of externally compelling statehood. The affairs of the state are absolutely not reducible to the sword, but the sword is their ultimate and necessary support. He who does not recognize the sword destroys the state, but in vain he thinks that in doing so he spares himself from a compromise. For all he does is prefer the weak-willed, cowardly, treacherous, and hypocritical compromise over a compromise which is strong-willed, courageous, selfless, and sincere. The sword as a symbol of human interposition in life and death is not, of course, morally perfect when it falls between men. But this moral imperfection is spiritually necessary in people's lives. Not everyone is able to take up the sword and fight while remaining in this struggle on a spiritual level. For this, not the worst people are needed, but the best people. People who combine nobility and strength, for the weak will not be able to bear this burden, while the ignoble will deform the very vocation of the sword. One of the tragic paradoxes of earthly human life is composed thusly. It is the best people who are called upon to fight villains, to enter into an inevitable interaction with them, to compel their evil will, to stop their evil activities, and moreover, to conduct this struggle by means which are not the best, among which the sword will always be the most direct and noble. To conduct a national struggle against villains is a necessary and spiritually correct pursuit, but the ways and means of this struggle can and do happen to be involuntarily unrighteous. And only the best people are able to endure this unrighteousness without becoming infected with it, to identify and observe its due dosage, to bear in mind its unrighteousness and its spiritual danger, and to find for these individual and collective antidotes. Lucky in comparison with the state's rulers are monks, academics, artists, and contemplatives who are given the opportunity to create pure work with clean hands. However, they should not bring trial and condemnation to the statesman and the warrior, but instead grant them gratitude, prayer, wisdom, and cleansing. For they must understand that their hands are clean for pure pursuits only because others have given their own clean hands for impure matters. They should remember that if in all people the fear of transgression was stronger than their love for good, then life on earth would be completely impossible. In one of his letters, St. Ambrose of Mediolanum speaks of the sadness that engulfs the angels when they have to leave the bliss of the Most High contemplation with all its tranquility and purity, and fly at the command of God to the earth, bringing judgment and punishment to evildoers, and the fire of God's wrath. It is mirthless and mournful for a good being to come out of the pleroma, face evil, and repay it equitably. And in this image, every noble bearer of force and the sword must find comfort and a source of strength for himself.